This is Greg Remke. I direct economic thinking, and I thought I'd record a short sort of intro to economics video for American Logos students this year. So economics for world schools debate, sort of an overview of micro and macro and public policy. This is going to be a general, from view from up in the sky. And the main focus is going to be on economic freedom and what policies enable prosperity and human flourishing. So let's give it a go. So the theme is the economic way of thinking. How do economists look at things, and how, as a debater, can you get a sort of a toolkit of ways to look at a whole range of public policy topics that are presented in parliamentary debate or extemp or world schools debate. Now, there's many ways to teach economics, and there's many kinds of economics. Economists disagree about, which things are the most important. To some extent, you're talking about how the economy works, the production and distribution of goods and services. But in a broader sense, you're looking at how society is organized. And of course, anthropology looks at this, and political science and sociology. But the economic side is how do societies produce the goods and services, the food that they eat, the clothing, the shelter? How do they make decisions? So you can have tribal or traditional economies, as in ancient times. You can have command economies like in Cuba now, or the Soviet Union, or North Korea. Or you could have market economies. Market economies where the people in political power aren't the people that make the economic decisions. But most economies are mixed. So even in the Soviet Union, where the government was in theory in charge of everything, something like 30% of all the food that was grown by everyday people on their own property or on their patio. They called them hobby gardens in communist Hungary because they wanted to make it a hobby, but it turns out the government was so bad at managing agriculture. The command economies only survived because people were allowed some limited area of private property to grow food. So in our market economy in the U.S., there's a huge role for government, right? Government manages much of the transportation, runs the schools, the post office, retirement with Social Security, Medicare for the elderly. So a big chunk of the U.S. economy is run by various government institutions at the local, state, and federal level. Similarly, in the European Union and Africa. So around the world, most economies are mixed. And then sort of the question is what mix works best, or what's most just, what creates prosperity. So Adam Smith is often presented as the father of economics, the first major economics books, although there were earlier ones that were very important. But The Wealth of Nations was part of the Scottish Enlightenment. Adam Smith was a moral philosopher, a professor in his earlier book, whose name escapes me, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, was looking at sort of how we live in society with other people. But Wealth of Nations was answering a different sort of question, which is full title, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. Because in Scotland, through the 1700s, the Scots were getting wealthy. I mean, Scotland was one of the poorest places in Europe in the 1600s, but it gradually got wealthy. People had, better food, better housing, better clothing. And the question Smith was wondering is why? Where does this prosperity come from that allows this Scotland, which is, cold and not where you'd expect tremendous wealth to emerge, why was it prospering? And the conclusion Smith comes to has to do with the division of labor. As companies were developing, people were specializing a lot with international trade. When Scotland united with England, it opened up to trade. So there's a lot of advances there, and there were advances in technology and agriculture and textiles. And later becomes the Industrial Revolution. But this is part of the whole story, the Scottish Enlightenment, which influences the American Revolution. A fun book on this is How the Scots Invented the Modern World, which looks at the outsized influence of Scots through not only the British Empire and England, but in the United States and around the world. So Macroeconomics you could think of as the whole economy, the big picture. But the field of macroeconomics is really in turmoil and debate over the last couple decades. It used to be macro was thought of how government officials would fine tune fiscal policy, government spending, or monetary policy, how many dollars were available, and that these models, ISLM and other models, would allow for the economy to be stable and not have the booms and busts that were blamed on the private sector. So that was macro, but various things happened. There was sort of a failure of macroeconomics in the 1980s. It was taught as, government was managed like wizards would decide, let's boost spending, or the economy's booming, let's cut back spending. But that didn't work. So there was a huge decline in the 1970s, government spending, Vietnam War, other sorts of issues, and the view of Keynesian economics, of these Keynesian models, went into decline, and macroeconomics sort of shifts to becoming development economics. What policies promote prosperity? Why is it that countries like Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and South Korea that were really poor in the 40s and 50s, were part of the third world, by the time you get to the 80s and 90s, they're prosperous. Now they're some of the wealthiest countries in the world. Yet during that same period, 1960 to 2000, India didn't get wealthy. It was ahead, and countries in Africa like Kenya and Nigeria, Ghana, they were as wealthy as the Southeast Asian countries in the 60s, but somehow they stagnated. So what institutions, what rules, what reforms might help prosperity? So, what reforms, policies might help Africans, India, China, Latin America? Now, China, of course, is the big story. China was incredibly impoverished in 1980 and transformed their economy with economic growth, free market policies, charter cities, foreign investment. China became really prosperous. Now, the last 10 years, they've had a sort of a new dictator in charge who's trying to clamp down on the success story there, and we don't know how that will turn out. Similarly, in Latin America, the wealthiest countries 30, 40 years ago were Venezuela and Argentina 70 years ago. Then Argentina changes economic policies, gets poor. Chile was the poorest in 1970 and 80. Now it's the wealthiest. So we've had a shift in countries go from poverty to prosperity, and also from relative prosperity to poverty. So we try and figure out why those policies, what happened. For one, selfish reasons. How do we prevent the United States from, falling off a cliff and getting poor? Or how do we fine tune or help our policies so that we get, more prosperous, growth rate in the coming years? Okay, so themes for extemp: parliamentary debate, world schools debate, society versus the state, how should education be managed, the mail, the roads, various decisions, the internet, who makes decisions on how various big parts of the economy are managed. Economics also looks at government. The public choice theory, or public choice economics, is the economics of government. The idea, what's often called constitutional economics, of why it's important to have constitutional restraints, that voting, electing officials, and legislation is supposed to be restricted in the United States by the Constitution, that says go ahead and do your elections and pass your legislation, but you can't legislate these issues because they're protected by the Bill of Rights. And the federal government should only be doing those things, those powers enumerated in the Constitution. So the argument there is you have a separate document passed outside of the legislature that limits the power of the legislature. And that was the traditional unwritten Constitution in the United Kingdom and the U.S. Constitution. Now things change, sort of the New Deal, Progressive Era, Great Society break some of the constraints in the Constitution, but it's important to understand the theory of it. An essay I pencil that we should have a link to is a quick discussion of basically Friedrich Hayek's famous essay, The Use of Knowledge in Society. that we prosper not only because of division of labor, people can specialize and get better at different things, but also the dispersion of knowledge. There's too much in the world. Nobody knows how to make a pencil. The knowledge about making a pencil is distributed around the world. Some people know how to develop the mahogany forests and cut down the trees and process the timber. Others know how to mine the graphite, sharpen the pencil, or I guess it's a pencil sharpener that does that. But the knowledge is distributed. So with a pencil, nobody knows, no single person knows how to make it. Imagine an iPhone or other technology devices, a car. The skills, the technology are distributed, and this global trading process where people buy and sell goods and services around the world is what allows us to mobilize that distributed knowledge. And there's critics of globalization, right? You don't want to outsource you're making your weapons if you're going to go to war with a country that's making your weapons. But the debate over globalization is a big issue among populists, among nationalists who want to have self-contained, who don't like trade. They want everything produced in their own country. So you've got a back and forth debate there. Economics is a lot about trade-offs. You buy stuff from China, it's less expensive. You try and make it here, it costs more. But if you insist on making all your steel and aluminum here and put big tariffs on it, then all the companies in the U.S. that use steel and aluminum, the car companies, washing machine, then they can't compete worldwide because they have to pay so much more for steel and aluminum. So anytime you restrict access to world markets for production, you're making your own companies less competitive. Okay, so there's benefits of exchange, division of labor, specialization. I talk some about the economic freedom and the economic freedom index, where we try to measure the freedom of people to start companies, the soundness of the currency, the freedom of trade, the transparency of the judicial system, the security of property rights. And I referenced this earlier. We've had a revolution in development economics because the countries that weren't expected to prosper, the Asian tigers, Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, suddenly took off, and then communist China emulated Hong Kong and Taiwan. They saw that, Chinese everywhere except China were prospering, so they began to copy those economic freedoms, and then prosperity grew rapidly in China over the last 40 years. So similar stories I mentioned. Chile, Ireland used to be the poorest country in Europe, in Western Europe in the 1980s. Now it's the most wealthy of the big countries. And so what policies changed in Ireland? Peru has prospered in the last couple decades. So one big aspect of these reforms comes from migration. And you've got huge debates over immigration and border policy and all the commotion of Africans and Middle Eastern trying to get into Europe and South and Central Americans trying to get into the U.S. But there's a separate sort of issue of the role of migration in economic development. So the three sort of pillars: international trade, international movement of capital, that is global investment, where British companies invested in the U.S. and paid for the railroads that we benefited from, and they earned profits when the railroads were profitable. French companies invested in early America. America prospered, and we invested in Mexico, invested in the Philippines, invested in Japan. So international trade of goods and services, international investment, that is the movements of capital, and then separately is the movement of people. And again, there's arguments against all these. People say, gosh, U.S. companies go broke because people are buying cheaper stuff from China or from Mexico. Or they say, we don't have control of our companies here because they're owned by a company in China or Japan or Germany. And they dislike the movement of people. Gosh, all these people coming here from Africa, from Mexico, from Eastern Europe or China, and people are... So there's trade-offs on all this, but in terms of promoting prosperity, the movement of ideas, of capital, of people is part of that. You want it to be legal. You don't want to have people investing illegally or migrating illegally. You want to have the legal system protect both Americans and people that are investing here and our investments elsewhere and people moving here. Okay, so another part of the story that's sort of invisible is shown in this book, Invisible Wealth, the hidden story of how markets work. We a lot of stuff that we can't see is key for prosperity. So this is the article about this. I have a link to it online, the New Europe, and this comes from presentations I was giving in Romania and in Bulgaria some years ago. So how do countries get wealthy? You might think, well, lots of resources. America has, oil and good soil and forests. And so, we got rich because we had all the stuff we could pull out of the ground. So also factories. We built factories. They're very efficient. We make cars. We make all this other stuff. So you might think that our natural resources helped us get rich, or the factories we built, the capital that Americans have that make us more productive when we go to work, the efficient transportation system. But a study by the World Bank shows the solid goods, these things are only 20% of the wealth of rich nations. And they're 40% of the wealth of poor countries. Poor countries, Indonesia has more raw materials, mining and one thing and another there. So if these physical things are only 20%, what's the rest? And so, again, this is part of a World Bank study, a book, and a recent Foundation articles. 2005, so 15 years old, but the same stories apply. 20% of the wealth of rich nations, 40% of the wealth of poor countries are these solid physical things, whether natural resources or capital. Human capital and the value of institutions, that is the knowledge people have in their heads, the ability to work together, and the institutions that protect people at work, protect companies and investment. These are the largest shares of wealth in all countries. So again, saying this again, natural capital, cropland, pasture land, forested areas, 5% of wealth. Produced capital, the stuff you make, 18%. 77% is considered intangible capital. And this is the raw labor that, some people are more skilled than others, the human capital, the knowledge that they have to do things, to work, to produce, and this knowledge and skills and the level of trust, right? So if you're in a society where people don't trust, then you've got to have monitors everywhere. Then no one trusts each other. Then people have to have guards in their homes. And that expense of trying to substitute for trust with security is costly for a society. So you have low trust societies that don't benefit as well. So part of your work as a debater and as an economist is to sort of get a sense of what we mean by these formal and informal institutions. This is particularly the case in the Middle East, where people's jobs, their property are not protected by the rule of law. They're instead informal, and it doesn't work as well. So here's an essay, The Causes of Economic Growth. Why did some countries prosper? I mentioned Scotland prospering and how the Scots invented the modern world. And before that, actually, one of the countries in Europe that prospered unexpectedly was Holland, a country that was poor and not many natural resources. Through the 1600s, Holland prospered, way wealthier than France and Spain and England, through a network of trade and mainly through immigration, through these huge numbers of people that came to Holland from around the world, expelled from France, the Huguenots, Armenians, Chinese Jews. They came to places where they were allowed to go, and one of those was Holland. And this is the author discusses this. So the Dutch were the first European republic. They were very tolerant of religions, and they had sound rights to property. And actually, this influenced America because the Pilgrims left England, went to Holland, went to Amsterdam, and they learned about markets and commerce, which is very culturally shifting for them, and then they came to the New World. But it's misleading to say that it was the Dutch that built the prosperity in Holland. They attracted people from all over the world, and those people brought knowledge and trading networks with them. And this story happens again. West Germany, after the Second World War, huge economic development of West Germany, the miracle that astounded the world. But it wasn't, it wasn't the Marshall Plan, it wasn't foreign aid, it was mainly migration, or a big part of it was. They opened up their institutions, lowered taxes, made it easier to start companies, and they had a huge migration of Germans who were expelled from other countries in Europe and Russia, Soviet Union, and came to Germany. I mean, it was a disaster in terms of the people who died and the awful suffering, but those people helped boost the economy. Then they had migrants from Yugoslavia came in large numbers under communist times, then migrants from Turkey. So these migrations helped Germany grow really fast. And other countries did too. Greece and Italy grew faster than Germany from 1900 to 1960, and migration into those countries after the disruption of World War II was key as well. So, migration's a big story. Scottish Enlightenment, migration to America from Europe, fastest growth in the history of the world was in America with large family sizes, but huge immigration. People came dirt poor, but the combination of free people, capital from Europe, and free enterprise allowed America to become the wealthiest country in the world very rapidly. So you have a century of the era of globalization from the end of the Napoleonic Wars, a massive flow of goods, investment, capital, and people around the world. There's been nothing like it since. Even now, the flows of capital aren't as high as they were in those time, in that period. Percentage-wise, the flow of people has never been that high, percentage-wise. And again, people opposed it. It led to U.S. anti-immigration policy and all sorts of concerns about the influx of Eastern Europeans and Southern Europeans. But in terms of prosperity, it helped people move. The best way to increase prosperity for a poor person is to, from Haiti, is to get out of Haiti. If you can get from Haiti and get to Texas or California, New York, your income quadruples. Even if you're doing the lowest paid job you can find. So that's how you create wealth. Now, unfortunately, we have political instability and we don't have a legal system that allows those migrations. We should have labor mobility to allow people to come legally, work legally, pay their taxes and be responsible, but we don't have much of a system for that yet. Canada has a bit more than the U.S., but there's still restrictions. Fears of overproduction, it's another story. Eugenics movement grows. And then from the 50s to the 80s, after the disruption of World War I and II, we have a return to global integration, increased trade, investment, and migration. Okay, I'm going to stop in just a minute recommending some books. Borderless Economics, Arrival City, Triumph of the City. You can go on Amazon and read, the first few pages of these free. There's some chapters available. It's a fantastic story, and it's the positive side of the growth of cities. So all around the world, people are migrating to cities by the millions. The big story in Africa is millions of people migrating to cities. In Nigeria, the average age is like 20, the median age. So half the whole population of Nigeria is under 20. In Ghana, I think it's under 18. So these people are growing up, they're getting married, they're looking for housing. So the growth of cities in Africa, as in China and Asia, China and India, are huge stories around the world. And the dynamics of how that works is important. It's the same thing happened in America in the 1800s, early 1900s, happened in Europe, happened in Japan. And I recommend Chandran Kukathas' book, Immigration and Freedom, that just came out some months ago. Alberto Mingardi from the Bruno Leone Institute has a review at this link. And he just, freedom, talking about this, freedom is an ordinary thing of being not hindered or obstructed. You're allowed to be homeschooled. That's didn't happen 50 years ago. It doesn't happen in other countries. The idea that you can raise your own kids the way you want to, you can work where you want, those ability to associate voluntarily with others, we sort of take for granted, but that's this idea of freedom. And in Immigration and Freedom, he talks about the idea of freedom, of being at ease, and Pericles in his famous eulogy is told by Thucydides. Athenians in their city is open to the world. People go about their business without being hampered by their neighbors. And they don't exclude foreigners from any opportunity, learning or observing, even though the eyes of the enemy may profit. Enemy can send people in to look around. But Athenian prosperity came by allowing craftsmen to come and more easily become citizens, contribute their wealth and knowledge and trade networks to Athens. So that's part of the story that Chandran tells in his book. And again, you can read the review and learn more about it online. Okay, so let me stop there and thank you very much for this intro, and I'll have more later.